A fight over women's rights was front and center at this year's Southern Baptist Convention held in Indiana. The Southern Baptists voted Wednesday to formally oppose in vitro fertilization, a procedure that many people who cannot get pregnant naturally rely on. The country's largest Protestant denomination firmly voted for a resolution to end IVF, marking the first time it weighed in on the issue. At the heart of the issue is the procedure itself, which often involves creating multiple embryos, some of which may be discarded. Dr. Albert Mohler, who helped craft the resolution, said the catalyst to move against this decades-old procedure was the Alabama Supreme Court February ruling that said embryos are to be treated as children.
But in a win for women, Southern Baptists rejected a ban on female pastors. This historic two-thirds vote is a major victory for those in the congregation who want local church autonomy and soften antagonism towards women in the ministry. The battle over women's roles in the church had been brewing for 2 years. So, Amber, very curious to get your opinion on this as a woman who is active in church. What do you make of this?
Yeah, so obviously I'm not Baptist, I'm Catholic, but I think I can speak a little bit to what was going on here. I've met Dr. Mohler, who brought forward this IVF proposal, but I guess let's start with the female pastors, because the church actually did not say that they were explicitly allowing female pastors, but the reason multiple members of the SBC voted against this particular proposal is that they say that there were already mechanisms in place for them to be able to oust churches that did have female pastors. So they basically viewed it as repetitive. The Southern Baptist Church has multiple times in the past couple of years said that churches who have female pastors are no longer in I think they refer to it as friendly communion with the SBC. So there was a California mega church called Saddleback that was removed last year or the year prior. And then even just this week, as they were having this conference in Indiana, they expelled a church that's in Alexandria, Virginia, for having female pastors. About 60% of people at this meeting voted for the proposal to explicitly ban churches who had female pastors, but they needed a two-thirds majority, 67%, in order for this to actually pass. So they were pretty close to getting it passed. But again, the only difference here is just that there's no enshrined rule that a church explicitly can't have a female pastor. It's just that they would have to go through whatever process already exists for removing a church that had one.
Right, it's interesting to have this kind of central organizing body making decisions for other churches other than their own congregations. I think if a congregation supports having a female pastor, they should be able to have one. It's interesting that there is a central organizing group making decisions like this. It's something I wasn't aware of before this story. The IVF decision is very fascinating to me. It puts women in a tough place in an economy where it's difficult to have a single income and have kids, and it requires working for quite some years before you can put enough money away and be stable if you're lucky to find a good enough job to have kids. It puts a real time crunch, I think, on women. And even younger women rely on IVF in some occasions to conceive, but it seems to me this is coming from the thing we always hear, which is that it needs to be done through God, and some kind of scientific intervention is unnatural. It's not God's way. I think, similar arguments are made in outlawing abortion, but I don't know. IVF, it's made from all of the things God gave us on earth to put together to be able to do it. And so I think it's interesting that always around conception and life, we always have religious morals coming into play. And so for them to come together and say, no, I bet there are Southern Baptists who maybe have been born through IVF or have had babies through IVF that now have to grapple, with this decision. And so that's very interesting to think about.
Yeah, so let's start with the central governing body of the SBC. Obviously, there's a similar hierarchy within the Catholic Church, which is significantly larger. But I think it's actually quite a useful thing to have for a church, because if you're someone who considers yourself a Southern Baptist, you want to be able to go to any church that is underneath that umbrella, and know that you have a consistent standard in terms of the theology that you're getting when you go there. Or let's say you move across the country and you see that there's a Southern Baptist church and you go there and it's really different from the church that you grew up in. There's a real benefit to having a consistent standard across a church. And in Protestantism in particular, there are a lot of different factions and sects of the Protestant religion. And so if churches don't want to abide by whatever the SBC's central committee decides, they can certainly break off from the SBC and potentially join another denomination or just be an independent church. And that's what we've seen these churches who have been kicked out of the SBC for having female pastors do. On the theology behind the opposition to female pastors, as well as IVF, which we got into a little bit there, there is biblical support for there not being female pastors. I would encourage people to look at Timothy, but also just the example of Jesus. All of his apostles were men. In the Catholic faith, we believe that priests are actually basically acting on behalf of Jesus when they do communion or when they do confession. And so it matters that Jesus was a male and that the priests are male. But if you want to learn more about, again, the underlying theology there, I would definitely recommend the Ascension podcast by Father Mike Schmitz, who breaks down a lot of theological questions in a very layperson way. On IVF, you're right to point out that people have a problem with procreation being separated from sex. The basic theology there is that sex was created for marriage, and the marital act is both unitive and procreative, which means it has a dual purpose of bringing a couple closer together in their marriage and also being open to life. And so if you separate either one of those purposes away from the marital act, whether you're doing the procreative part without the unitive part or the unitive part without the procreative part, then you run into some moral quandaries there. But even on just the life side of things, in terms of the SBC obviously being pro-life, IVF does often result in embryos being discarded or kept frozen for long periods of time. And so just from a pro-life standpoint, separate from the theological issue, that would be another reason why people might oppose IVF.
Yeah, it's interesting living in a country with the freedom of religion, how many different denominations we have and how strong the church can be and how much money they can collect when they're not paying taxes. It's just amazing. They become so powerful. It's like fast food chains. You have the same Taco Bell in every city and the same SBC. You know what you're going to get, the same Jesus teachings preached to you by a man. It's all very fascinating to me as someone who has not been a regular churchgoer, but has experimented and checked it out and seen what I like in different places. And I think that's the cool part of freedom of religion, is you have the freedom to choose your religion and the freedom to leave your religion and, see what's out there and see what fits your morals. And so I think if there are people that are members of the SBC that, they feel that some of the decisions don't add up, I think it's beautiful we live in a country where, your religion is not forced upon you and you can go to a different church. So I hope if there are women that would like to see women in the ministry, they're happy about, having the option to stick with their denomination and go to a church that's led by a female pastor. And I think, if you're upset about the IVF thing, there's a lot of churches in America and you can pick a different one. And I think that's beautiful.
Yeah, exactly. If they're not happy with what came out of the convention this week, then there are plenty of other denominations that might have a more liberal and less traditional stance towards those things, and they're more than welcome to join those. So we're going to take a break. We'll be back with more Rising after this.